is a course that I taught in the spring of 2019 for the honors program. It was Honors 202, and it was on the American Civil Rights Movement. And connected with it was a spring break trip that was very much integrated into the class to Georgia briefly, but primarily to Alabama. So what I'm going to do is very briefly kind of walk you through the course and how it was constructed, but really I want to focus on the trip in particular, the trip to Alabama, what we did, what we saw, and what the impact was for me personally, frankly, and for the students as well. And what I can say is that all of you who are watching this now or watching it as a recording later on, you're going to see images of some places that we don't often think of here in the Northeast as places to go see. And many of them are places that you really, really should go see as Americans. Very, very important to go see. So I'm going to tee up actually first let me introduce the students and then I'll tee up my PowerPoint. So Anne-Marie briefly introduced you to them. I'll tell you just a tiny bit more about them and then you'll hear from them periodically over the next, whatever it is, 40 minutes or so, 30 minutes. Ethan Anderson, Ray Dinsmore, Nicole Aruda, all history majors, all took the course and went on the trip. Ethan is going to be doing graduate work in queer studies at University of London as soon as the pandemic allows him to do so. Ray is in a PhD program in 20th century American history now at University of New Hampshire. And Nicole is going to be doing international politics at Trinity College in Ireland again as soon as the pandemic enables her to do so. So we've got three amazing students. They were amazing in spring of 2019 and they're amazing now too. So let me pull up my PowerPoint. Okay. Can everybody see that? I hope. Oops, just went and I didn't want it to go. Oops.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, I just have to make sure it's moving in the direction I want it to. That's odd. Oh wait, I see. That's it. Okay. Sorry, it's the first time I've used PowerPoint and Zoom at the same time. It's sort of a little techie overwhelming for me. So the class was on the Southern Civil Rights Movement primarily, although we did talk about the movement in northern cities, after spring break later on. And I always envisioned the course as being something that would include a trip. And there were a variety of different themes that I really wanted to focus on in the course. And one was, and remember spring 2019, this is, well, certainly not before Black Lives Matter, it's before the most recent kind of reckoning with racial inequality that this nation has been confronted with over the last year or so. But I really wanted the students to really think through the decisions that people in the civil rights movement in the South made in the context in which they made it, the sort of moral and strategic dilemmas that they faced. I in particular wanted to focus on the critical role of youth activism in challenging the Jim Crow system of racial separation and segregation and inequality in the South. Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others are, of course, famous and revered and rightfully so. But we, of course, also just mourned the loss of, John Lewis, a great American who made an enormous difference in the civil rights movement in the 1960s when he was the same age as my students are. Youth activism, enormously important. Part of the reason, I'll talk more about this in a second, but part of the reason why the trip went along with it is that, history can feel like a kind of abstract list of names and dates and details sometimes. It's hard to really understand and get a feel and be kind of morally challenged by something that you study in the past without really having the chance to see the places where it took place. And if you can, and I'm a modern American historian, so this is possible, meet the people who made the history or who were there, right, who were witnesses to it. My conviction in that, my belief in that really comes from a very personal place in that regard. I'm Jewish, and I learned about the Holocaust in Hebrew school, and I read about it, and I saw it in films, but I don't think I really understood it in the most profound way and felt called to do something, I guess, in response to having that knowledge until I went to Auschwitz and saw the camps. So, and talked to people, you know, not there, but talked to people in other circumstances who had survived the Holocaust. So we have a chance. It's a fleeting chance. It is a chance that will end at some point in the next decade or so, probably, to learn from the people who made this history, who changed this country to move it in a more racially just direction. And so I wanted to give the students and frankly myself the chance to do that. And then the last part, the sort of mission behind both the class and the trip, was to connect racial inequality in the past, activism to try and change it, and the persistence of racial inequality in the present, particularly around the issue of voting rights, which of course now in 2020 has, you know, emerged or reemerged as a big issue, a very big issue. So we began the trip. I'll talk about the mechanics of the trip at the end, like, you know, how we paid for things and how we got around, and, you know, how I ate too much soul food while we were there and all that kind of stuff. But at the moment, I just want to kind of give you the narrative of where we went with my lame attempts at depicting it through photography. So we flew into Atlanta, and on our very first day, essentially straight from the airport, we went to Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. King's birth home, which you see depicted in the middle here, and then the memorial for Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, all within 2 or 3 blocks of one another in this historically Black neighborhood in Atlanta. Ebenezer Baptist Church is where Dr. King's father was a minister. Dr. King himself did his first preaching in that church. If I remember correctly, when we went in and sat in the pews, they were playing a sermon that he had given at some particular point, which had to do with economic justice, if I remember correctly. As we went through his birth home, which you see in the middle there, they tried to preserve everything right down to the things in the kitchen and the toys on the floor, as it would have looked like when Dr. King was a child. And you know, if there's, you know, anyone who is a kind of painted figure in American history, it's Dr. King. But seeing all of this really humanized him in a variety of different ways. You know, certainly for me it did, and I think for many students it did as well. And then we drove from Atlanta to Montgomery. And really on our first full day in Montgomery in Alabama, we had a hell of a full day, I'll put it that way. We visited the Equal Justice Initiative, now made famous, you know, by, of course, Brian Stevenson and the Hollywood film Just Mercy that came out about his work with folks on death row and fighting racial inequality in the criminal justice system. And Brian Stevenson, of course, is famous, and rightfully so, for that work. But coming out of his work looking at the criminal justice system in the South and seeing the racial inequalities in that system, he increasingly came to the conclusion that we were never really going to have racial justice in America today unless we understood the historical roots of where we're at now. And so he began to use the Equal Justice Initiative to try and essentially get Americans to, particularly white Americans, but Americans in general, to confront the history of their country with regard to racial inequality, things that we have swept under the rug or perhaps think that we have solved in some sort of way. And he was very much motivated by the idea of a kind of truth and reconciliation process, which has taken place in other countries around the world, post-apartheid South Africa, for example, where the only way to sort of move forward is through telling the truth about the past, no matter how ugly, and through that engaging in a process of open communication and reconciliation, so we can move on to a more, you know, peaceful and just existence. So the Equal Justice Initiative has 2 really remarkable public monuments in Montgomery. One is the Legacy Museum, which I'll save for after we talk about this here. We did them in reverse order on the trip. And the other is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And the National Memorial for Peace and Justice is a memorial of those African Americans, predominantly male African Americans, who were the victims of lynching in predominantly the South, but not just the South, from the end of the Civil War roughly until the start of the modern civil rights movement in the mid-1950s. The Equal Justice Initiative has done research on all the lynchings that were reported in that period, and then they have sought to tell this story and make sure that Americans know this story. So I'm gonna, sorry for going all sort of professorial for about 2 minutes, but I'm gonna do that anyway. This is a map from the Equal Justice Initiative study Lynching in America, which is available online for free on their website, and I highly recommend it. This is actually an interactive map. Here it's just a screenshot, but it says, you know, there are over 4,000 lynchings of African Americans, overwhelmingly men, between 1877 and 1950. In the vast majority of cases, the documents are pretty clear. They had not committed a crime in any sense that we would consider it to be a crime, and even those who may have did not get a trial or a fair trial. They were taken out of jail by a mob and generally lynched. You may think that these, and what this map depicts is of course the different places in the South. You can't see my hand, I'll use my arrow here. The different places in the South where the numbers of lynchings were the highest. So the darker the red, the brighter the red, the higher the number. Lynchings were not done in secret or in private. They were generally done in public. This is a lynching of an African-American young man named Ted Smith, who was lynched in Greenville, Texas on the town square in 1908. This was actually turned into a postcard, sold and shared through the U.S. mail. You'll notice in the crowd in the back, there are men, there are women, there are children. It is not a secret thing. It is very much a public thing that was seen by whites in the South as essentially part of keeping African Americans in their place, more or less. This, of course, the possibility for African Americans in the South of stepping out of their proper place in the eyes of white society created enormous fear of the threat of violence. It eventually sparked a movement of millions of African Americans to leave the South, to move to northern cities in the 20th century. You know, this just sort of gives you a sense of the scale of some of the lynchings that took place. This is a lynching of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas. This is one of the most famous lynching photographs in American history. It's of Reuben Stacy, a young man in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 1935. It was the Depression. He was an agricultural laborer, homeless, jobless, had no food, was going door to door begging for food. The Jim Crow traditions were such that no black man should approach the front door of a white person's house, especially a white woman's house. He didn't know that. He rang the doorbell to ask for food. The white woman who answered the door screamed, and they hanged him from the tree in her front yard. So back to Montgomery, the Equal Justice Initiative has created this memorial for the between 4,000 and 5,000 people who were lynched during this time period. And I'll kind of walk you through what this looks like, and Ray's going to tell you a bit about his experience with it as well. It is above the city of Montgomery, so once you're, and this particular part here itself is elevated, so as you sort of walk up the hill to get here, you know, you can look down on the city of Montgomery, which of course was a slave trading river port when slavery was legal in the United States. There is some statuary here towards the front depicting a slave family being separated, you know, sold to different places. a very common experience amongst American slaves. And here, of course, you see some of our students, and I see Ray there. Not sure where Ethan and Nicole are. They're further along, but they're all there. So the way this is structured is that they have these Corten steel monuments that really look like gravestones and are meant to look like gravestones. One for each county in the United States where a racial terror lynching took place. The names of the lynching victims are, if they know their names, are engraved on the columns along with the date. So here you see, keep pointing with my finger, realizing you can't see that, Broward County, Florida. And this is actually Reuben Stacy here, who I just mentioned a second ago, who was lynched in 1935. When you first walk in, the columns are right in front of you. Then as you walk down further into it, the columns gradually go up to the point where by the time you get to the downstairs part, they are over your head, somewhat similar to somebody hanging from a tree during a lynching, you know, what they might be. And at the bottom is this, you know, beautiful, really kind of thoughtful, almost prayerful kind of space, you know, where you can sit and talk to people if you choose to do so, but also kind of contemplate what you've seen. I'll turn to Ray in just a second, but one other thing I wanted to mention is that they've created a duplicate of each one of these monuments or columns, which they will give to the county listed on it to put up in their own county and to have some sort of truth and reconciliation process surrounding it, so that the people in that community whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers lynched other people's great-grandfathers and grandfathers can have some sort of truth and reconciliation process. And that has happened slowly in dozens of communities, and hopefully the numbers will grow. So Ray, I know you wanted to offer just a couple of reflections on what you saw and thought through this experience. Don't forget to unmute yourself to do so.
Yeah, I think that was a great synopsis of, I couldn't think of anything else to add as far as the way you described it. I've given several mini lectures actually on this sense at UNH, because we, you know, in my classes we'll discuss the ones I'm TAing for and the ones I'm in. We'll discuss lynching in the U.S. and I'm the only person that I know of that's been there, and it is slowly becoming quite popular. I've never actually seen this picture of myself sitting there. I probably sat there for about an hour, and I would say it's probably one of the most profound, like, spiritual experiences of my life. I'm not a particularly spiritual person. But I still would describe this event as being probably the most profound place I've ever been to, piece of art. You know, I wrote my personal statement to grad school about it, and then there was pretty much no doubt about the fact that that's what it would be about. I just wanted to, I mean, the artistic majesty of it's undoubtable, but I just wanted to share an experience that I only ever wrote. I very rarely share it, but I only ever wrote about it in my personal statement. Before we approach this area, as the pillars are going down, there was a little African-American girl. She was probably 7 to 10 years old, and she was talking to a you know, someone who works at the exhibit, monitors around, answers questions, and she asked, you know, what was all this about. And in the truth and reconciliation tradition, she told her exactly what it was about, the worker. And I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but I did hear the conversation, and it was really powerful. You can't really intellectualize or process that conversation immediately. It's a little too much, and I think ever since that conversation, I had a different perspective on the entire, especially as someone coming from the North. There's a million ways in which I'm an outsider to this experience. And it's an experience there's just no way I could have had it, you know, up here in the Northeast. So yeah, I think that was a great synopsis. I'm, you know, when you see the pictures, you start going through it again.
Yeah, I think I said that to you in the email I sent to you guys. I mean, this is the first time I've gone through them in a while, and it hit me pretty hard looking at them. So, just a few more images here. Whoops, I lost my arrow. There it is. So the Legacy Museum is also the Equal Justice Initiative. We actually visited them in the reverse order, but I wanted to put this here simply. Well, I'll explain it in just a second. The quote on the left, I think, is pretty resonant of really what Ray just said, but also, to be honest, of the whole kind of guiding idea of why this trip is really important for UMass Dartmouth students to go on, quite frankly. That if we can't change the past, but if we face it with courage, we don't need to repeat it, right? So the Legacy Museum, very briefly, really is a kind of history of race in America, really focused on the continuing relevance of slavery and Jim Crow and the racial inequalities and misunderstandings that it generated for the present, and in particular trying to connect those things in the seemingly distant past to inequalities we see today in policing and criminal justice in particular. But another part of the Legacy Museum, the thing that sort of ties the two things together, the National Memorial and the Legacy Museum, is that part of what EJI is doing is trying to help the descendants of those who were lynched return to the places where their ancestors were lynched and collect dirt from that site, because they never had the chance to bury their relatives in any meaningful sense. To collect that dirt, put it in jars, take one home for the family, but also put one on the shelf at the Legacy Museum. I didn't grab a picture of the whole. I mean, it's terrifying, frankly. Horrible. When you see the whole wall, it's akin to visiting Auschwitz and seeing the containers of just eyeglasses from those who died in Auschwitz. It has that sort of impact. But this is the dirt that was collected where Reuben Stacy was lynched in Fort Lauderdale on July 19th, 1935. So that was just Sunday. This will speed up after that, but that was just Sunday, our first full day on the trip. The next day in Montgomery, I believe it was the next day, what I tried to do with the trip was have us sort of alternate between going to historic sites like the ones I just showed you and meeting people who were participants in the civil rights movement. So in Montgomery, we got to meet Jane Graetz, who Nicole will talk about in just a second on the left, and you can see Nicole and Ethan there. And on the right, Rip Patton, who was a freedom rider, and we went to the Freedom Rides Museum and got to meet him. So Jane Graetz, her husband was a Reverend, Robert, I think his name was, and they were friends with Rosa Parks. They were friends with Dr. King, and I believe they were the only white people in Montgomery who essentially took the side of the Montgomery bus boycotters in 1955 and 1956. Their home was bombed as a consequence. She's a remarkable woman of advanced age and incredible energy. She's quite remarkable. No, it wasn't Nicole, it was Ethan. You were going to say something about this, right?
Yeah. Like you said, it was super. I think it was very incredible to meet her. Her husband, Robert, who was a close associate of Dr. King, actually, I think just passed a few weeks ago in September 2020. And that just goes to underscore sort of the urgency of this history and this story, as we're losing the people who are telling these stories at a sort of alarming rate. The one thing that really struck me, not only with meeting with Mrs. Graetz, but with meeting with all the people we spoke to, was their willingness to share their stories of, obviously they sacrificed so much. Mrs. Graetz's house was bombed several times by white terrorists. They sacrificed so much emotionally, and many of them physically too, and their willingness to tell us about those incredibly hard times in their life was something that I found inspirational and invaluable.
Thanks, Ethan. And Rip Patton, I was just going to mention before I move on to the next slide, the Freedom Rider. He was a senior at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. He essentially was given a choice, if I remember correctly, by his university president, which is you can get on that bus in Nashville and go down to Alabama and Mississippi, or you can graduate. You can't do both. And he chose to go on the Freedom Rides, was arrested, spent time in jail in, I believe, both Montgomery and Jackson, Mississippi. He's now in his 70s. I think TSU gave him an honorary degree eventually, if I remember correctly, later on. But, you know, when we study this, it all seems like it's in the past, but then you meet somebody who, when they were the same age as the students, you know, decided they had to take a, you know, sort of step onto the stage of history as a citizen and a decent human being. It's a pretty inspiring thing to see. Also in Montgomery, we visited Dr. King's church, his first job as a minister at the Dexter Avenue Church. We visited the parsonage where he and Coretta Scott King lived. We also visited the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is still a very important institution in American life today, keeping track of hate groups. And there has been really an explosion of hate groups in the United States over the last 4 years or so. You know, just a week ago, right, the FBI found one of these groups concerning kidnapping the governor of Michigan, which I'm sure everybody read about in the news. We went to Selma, and in Selma, we of course saw some historic sites and also met some remarkable people. Our guide in Selma was an incredible woman named Joanne Bland, who is seated right here. And she took us to a child care center in Selma for some home-cooked fried chicken, which was awesome, and sweet tea. And she also introduced us to a couple of friends of hers. Joanne Bland was the youngest protester in the marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights in 1965. And a lot of her young friends, now perhaps not so young, joined her to tell us about their experiences. Kirk Carrington is the gentleman seated to her right. I don't think I have Brenda McCrae in any of these photographs, but I might have her in the next one. Yeah, there she is. I love this picture just because I love Kirk Carrington's expression in the front there. And we were along with a URI group for part of the trip, so you see some of them in some of the photographs too. So the food was pretty amazing, and hearing their stories as well. You know, they were young people, they were scared, they didn't know, you know, what was going to happen. Many of them, as Ethan just kind of talked about, have suffered from something like PTSD since, from some of the violence that they saw and experienced as young people, really just living under the Jim Crow system, but also in taking the brave step of trying to change that system so that they and people they loved did not have to grow up under it. So Joanne then took us to two different places, and here I will give over to Nicole because you'll see that she's in the picture on the right. But Joanne took us to the Brown Chapel AME Church, which in many ways is the birthplace of the Voting Rights Act. You know, you can make the case that American democracy, properly understood, began in this little piece of cement behind this church in Selma, Alabama, which has no national markers or anything else. In fact, Joanne was trying to convince us to draw public attention to it so that they could preserve it before it was knocked down for, you know, some other use. Because the marches that went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that ultimately led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act began there. That's where they started. That's where Joanne, when she was 13 or 14, gathered with friends, family, and neighbors to march for voting rights. Nicole, did you want to chat about this for a second?
So this was probably one of my favorite days on the trip, just because you know, for Selma, it's not the capital, it's not Montgomery. So you're really seeing that economic impact that, you know, the community is feeling, not just now, but even back in the 60s. A lot of things still look kind of the same. In this picture, she's holding my hand, and it's because I was holding this little pebble that I got down there. And for me, she had told me, you know, keep this pebble with you always, and, you know, you'll always remember this spot that you came. This is living history. So that really hit me because, you know, towards the end, I had told her, you know, like, thank you so much for all that you've done. Like, you've really paved the way for people. And every single person that I ever talked to on that trip that was in the movement, none of them thought anything they did was of uber importance. Like, they didn't want thank yous. They didn't think they deserved it. So it was really eye-opening because you'll read books about John Lewis and everyone that was in the movement and idolize them. But when you go there and you really experience it, it kind of just hits you in a different way where it feels more personal because they don't see themselves as heroes like people on the outside see them. So I will carry this rock forever.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, and one of the things that I should mention, I had forgotten about it until I was going through these photographs. Seems like almost everywhere we went, and maybe the pandemic has caused me to block this out because you can't do this anymore. Everywhere we went, when people talked to us, they would have us all go in a circle, join hands, and sing more often than not. And, you know, we reserved Yankees were, you know, a little sort of, I don't know if I can, you know, by the end of the week, we were, you know, we were all into it. So, you know, no hand sanitizer necessary. And then Mrs. Bland took us to a Confederate cemetery in Selma. And, you know, Ray can correct me if I don't get the facts of this right, but the way I remember it is that the Daughters of the Confederacy were going to build a monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest, a remarkably unaccomplished Confederate officer who nonetheless is famous among many Southerners, who was also the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. And they were going to build it downtown on the city square, the Green. By that point, African Americans, because of the Voting Rights Act, because of the marches in Selma, had enough political power to stop them from doing that. And so the Daughters of the Confederacy bought private property in this live oak cemetery and put all these Confederate memorials here. And Joanne took us there to talk about that, which of course was a hot topic in 2019, and it remains one now. So Ray, I know you wanted to say something about this because this was a pretty profound experience for you too. If you want to do that real quick.
Yeah, sure. This is an incredible spot, along with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. I talk about this a lot, whether in conversation, when talking about, you know, if you're in a conversation about Black Lives Matter, or something like that. This is a profound spot. This is a Confederate graveyard in the middle of a predominantly Black graveyard, right in the center, prime real estate in a predominantly Black town, Selma, Alabama, bought by the Daughters of the Confederacy, where there's a massive statue, the biggest statue in the cemetery, to a Confederate soldier. And there's, while they do want to get the Nathan Bedford Forrest statue put up, there's also a plaque talking about how Lincoln invaded the South and the valiancy of Nathan Bedford Forrest. It's actually remarkable to watch the irony in some ways. And I think Ethan and Nicole could attest to this because we experienced it together and we were talking. Very emotional for people. Emotional in a way that this was one of the more emotional places I saw people as far as we talk about like anger and disgust. And I talked to Miss Bland about it. We had a conversation trying to apply all the principles of the trip. And I think the most profound thing she said to me was that this was erected in 2008 after the election of Barack Obama. That's a profound realization about how this history continues to today. And it's one of the, it's off the beaten path, and it's something that only Miss Bland would be able to educate us on. But it's just another aspect of the trip that's completely inimitable. I don't know. I can't say that word correctly. You can't replicate it.
Cool. Thank you, Ray. Yeah, you can't replicate it in part also because it's a beautiful place, in the most sort of gothically horrible kind of way, and experiencing it through Joanne's eyes, through Mrs. Bland's eyes, was part of the power of it. I think if it had just been us from Massachusetts and we just went and looked at this, we'd have had a really interesting conversation. But, you know, Joanne spent her entire 70 odd years growing up in this city, knowing that there are people in this city who don't value the lives or bodies of people like her equally. And are willing to demonstrate that in a very public sort of way, you know, is an eye-opening thing to hear. It's an eye-opening thing for a white person in particular to hear. So here is the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where the famous marches took place. First Bloody Sunday, I believe on March 7th, 1965. Turnaround Tuesday, obviously on Tuesday. 2 days later, and then eventually the marchers go all the way through to Montgomery and finish at the Montgomery State Capitol within a stone's throw of Dr. King's church. And so we did walk across the bridge, of course, not in the middle of the street because it's a busy street. So we walked on the sidewalk. And that very same day, we then went out to the surrounding rural county, Lowndes County, outside of Selma. Lowndes County was a pretty terrifying place to be a Black person trying to vote, or really just trying to be a citizen. In the 1960s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was an interracial nonviolent group of white and Black youths from all around the country who came down to try and change the South. That's where John Lewis got started in his activism. They were very active in organizing in Lowndes County, trying to get Black sharecroppers and farmers registered to vote, despite terror from local sheriffs, business people, the Klan, taking their land and in some cases taking their lives to try and do it. And we had the great good fortune of gathering in Joanne Mance, who worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, gathering in her living room. She just invited us into her living room and took out all of these pictures of people that she had worked with. Many of whom have passed on now, because she believed it was deeply important that these brave people who are not famous should be remembered, right? That this is, you know, kind of how democracy is created. And Ray, I know you've been reading about this subject and you wanted to say something about it, that experience too, right?
Yeah, just a quick note on something that this trip can provide for you. I mean, recently I read a book called Bloody Lowndes, and I met the author of that book who wrote in-depthly about this, and I was able to talk to him about this experience with Joanne Mance. And it's just that kind of personal connection I had with somebody. He's at Ohio State right now as a professor, Hassan Jeffries, whose brother is actually Congressman Jeffries from New York. And we were just able to talk about this experience, and it really, it just shows you the power of the local movement, which is something that Dr. Santow, I know, was trying to impart onto us. But this is another situation where you wouldn't, maybe many people haven't heard about Lowndes County. It's famous for other reasons, but it's a perfect example of the real beauty of this trip in many ways.
Thanks, Ray. And we went to Birmingham. We really just spent one day in Birmingham. And right around the same kind of center part of the city are some famous places that we visited. So the Kelly Ingram Park, and you see some photograph here on the left, is where children, really, middle school, high school, some college students, African American, were essentially marching to try and end the Jim Crow system, peacefully protesting. Sheriff Bull Connor turned his dogs on the young people and the fire department's water hoses on them. This was seen all across the country on television news. It is arguably what caused President Kennedy to introduce the Civil Rights Act, which passed the next year, was signed by President Johnson. In many ways, this is where the Civil Rights Act, which is the sort of foundation of racial and actually gender equality in the United States, was kind of born from high school students exercising their right to peacefully assemble and speak. And I thought this quote, which was from a teacher at a black school in Birmingham, she said, "The marches taught the children more about democracy than any classroom lecture." I, of course, think classroom lectures are really useful, but that said, I think her point is fairly clear. The 16th Street Baptist Church is where the young people gathered before they marched, but it's probably, unfortunately, most famous for the terrorist act that took place there in September 1963, when the Klan placed sticks of dynamite under those stairs you see there on a Sunday during Sunday school, and 4 little African-American girls were killed in that explosion. That, not to move back or forward in time here, but one of the reasons why the civil rights movement decides to go into Selma to focus on voting rights is they wanted to do something with the anger they felt after this terrorist act in Birmingham, not too far away. And then we met some people in Birmingham too, some veterans of the civil rights movement. And we met Charles Avery. We met, sorry, I have to look up the names here. Oh, they're right there. Paulette Roby and Janice Kelsey. And the cool thing about Birmingham is that a lot of the children who marched in 1963 have gotten together now as adults and created an office where people can come in and just meet people. You know, we went and got some soul food and sat down and chatted with them. I had chicken gizzards with hot sauce, and they were awesome. Ethan, I think you wanted to talk about this experience.
Yeah, I just want to briefly share that, you know, it goes back to the value of the trip as, you know, it's one thing to see the 16th Street Baptist Church, you know, you sort of see the monuments, memorials, you see the statues in Kelly Ingram Park. But if you walk 5 minutes down the road, there's this entire institution that's dedicated to talking to these people, to bringing this history to life. And, you know, not only I think it's valuable as me as a historian, I think just my development as a person and, you know, just equipping me to you know, we're having this national conversation now that's sort of sparked off about racial inequality. And, you know, meeting a lot of these individuals has really defined the way that I have conversations with people. And I think that's, you know, it goes to the total value of this trip.
Yeah, and they were, you know, they were high school students. They're not now, of course, but they were high school students when they did this. And so part of the stories they told us, particularly the Paulette and Janice, was really just about like which kids in the high school marched. Was it the football kids or the cheerleading kids or the popular kids? Or, you know, they sort of brought us back because all of us have had some aspect of a high school experience that has the same sort of breakfast club vibe to it at some point. Sorry, that's a very specific generational reference, but anyway, and it humanized it, right? I mean, it brought it back to, you know, brought it back to us in some sort of living way. And we met yet another civil rights activist in her living room, Barbara Shores, who's in the middle here, right next to Nicole, and there you can see Ethan and Ray back there. Ray looking a little more fuzzy than he does now. Barbara Shores lived on Dynamite Hill in Birmingham. This is the house she grew up in. You know, it was her parents' house, and now it's her house. Dynamite Hill was a nickname for the neighborhood. It was the black middle-class professional neighborhood, and it was called Dynamite Hill because essentially any of the African-American families in this neighborhood that tried to speak out on issues of civil rights would often have their homes bombed by the Klan and by others. Barbara Shore's house was bombed several times. This very room we were in, this part of the house, was bombed when she was a child. Her dog was killed, if I remember correctly, and she, of course, was terrified. And people would fire guns into the house. Her dad was Dr. King's attorney, I believe. Barbara Shores also grew up knowing the little girls who were killed in the 16th Street church. Barbara Shores also, I think, became the first black female judge in the history of Alabama later on, and now retired. And all of these people were so, they were thankful to have us there, but they so deeply believed in the importance of sharing their stories while they had the chance to share them. And I think that's part of the urgency of trying to do this trip again sometime soon, is that people's stories need to be shared and passed on. So we also had some guest speakers in our classroom. So this is back at UMass Dartmouth, and we're just about at the end here. I think this is my last slide, because we have some veterans of the civil rights movement right in our midst here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So Gloria Clark, who lives in New Bedford, now works at BCC, but she, as a young person, went down to Mississippi to register Black voters to vote in the Freedom Summer of 1964. She's on the left, still as sort of active as ever. David Riley is on the right. He lives in Providence, about 3 blocks from where I live. David Riley also went down to Mississippi as a young college student to work for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So, I tried to have us meet people when we were back on campus too. So I wanted to kind of end things with these 2 quotes. One of them will look familiar to you because it's outside the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, and that's Maya Angelou's quote. And James Baldwin's quote is similar, right? Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We have a debate right now in this country, the president recently participating in it, that there is something somehow unpatriotic or radical or un-American about telling the truth about America's historical past. This class is really based on, and I think good education is based on the premise that we should never fear the truth. It's very hard to be good people and good citizens if we fear the truth. And I think having the chance to go to these places and talk to people who were there is a crucial part of that. So how are we on time, Anne-Marie? Because I want to make sure I leave time for questions.
We have about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes, okay. Well, I'm going to skip to this part just because I want to say a few practicalities, and then I'll come back around to questions and anything Nicole and Ethan and Ray would like to add here at the end. The trip was free for the students. They bought things here and there, and we all like coffee, so that happened from time to time and so forth. But the trip was otherwise free for the students, and that was really important for us to do that. We didn't want anybody to feel like they couldn't go, or for anybody to really take on a major sacrifice to go, because it was part of the class. We talked about the trip before and after. It was a common experience for all of us. I believe altogether, once you added in flying up and back, renting a van, renting hotel rooms, paying for food, the South thankfully is cheaper than the North, paying for stipends for guest speakers, that kind of thing. It roughly came out to about $1,000 a student. We had, I think, 10 students plus 2 faculty members. There are some economies of scale where it could get cheaper per student if there were more students, although I think for it to really work in terms of discussions and community building, you wouldn't want it to be much bigger than 10, 12, or 15 students probably, but one could debate that. So, if this is something that we want to try and offer for UMass Dartmouth students in the future, that's more or less what the cost of it is. This was an honors class. The honors program raised money for it. I wrote a grant or 2, but the honors program raised money for it. It would really be great to have this available to any UMass Dartmouth student who wants to go, not just honors students. I think it could be a pretty transformative thing for a lot of people. Nicole, Ethan, and Ray, I don't know if you want to say anything sort of summative. I want to make sure I do get to answer questions from people. But you're welcome to, if you have something you're burning to say about the long-term impact or importance of this, please do say it.
I'll go. I like being verbose, and the only thing I like more than that is a captive audience. So I I just want to say, as I was kind of contemplating this, I want to say two things. One, I think we went over a lot of the substantive details of the trip, and something that's not been talked about as much is the community that he just alluded to right there, Dr. Santow. Ethan and Nicole are two of my closest friends now, and I did not know them before the trip. Really, I had 2 classes with Ethan, and I precipitously ignored him because I'm not a very nice person. But since then, I mean, I love the guy. I can't look at him without smiling, and it wouldn't have happened without being in the back of a crowded bus, which is, I would still describe as one of the best experiences of my life. And also, I think this trip really epitomizes the tradition of UMass Dartmouth as a first-generation, largely working-class school. It was the first time I was on a plane. I wouldn't have gotten these opportunities without UMass Dartmouth and without the honors program and Dr. Santow. And it completely changed my life. I mean, it totally informed everything I decided to do, and I am doing in grad school. And it really epitomizes, to me, the best part of UMass Dartmouth as someone who graduated there very recently. I just wanted to say my piece on that because it really matters to me a lot. And I'm infinitely grateful that we got to go.
Thanks, Ray.
I just want to kind of sound off on what Ray said and totally agree with him. It was an amazing opportunity, and by far and away the best opportunity I had at UMass Dartmouth, my entire college experience. I kind of want to touch back on the value of this trip very quickly. The discussion of racial inequality and the history of this country is something that's touching all sectors of working life. It's not just happening in higher education. It's not just happening, as historians, we're not just having that discussion. Business people are having that discussion. It's happening in science. It's happening in arts. And I think sending students into the world without this knowledge of this history is, it's ill-equipping them to have those conversations. And hopefully, for the betterment of our country, these conversations will continue. So I think that to that regard, obviously there's a cost associated with this trip, but the ultimate the ultimate goals of it and what I took out of it personally are priceless. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan.
I can honestly say that this trip changed the entire track of my career, my life. It has strongly impacted me in so many ways. I have traveled since I was a little kid. So I've been to a lot of different places and I've experienced a lot of different cultures, but this is right in our own country, and this has impacted me more than any other cultural experience that I've ever had. It decided where I was going to go, what I was going to do for grad school. And I think it's super important to send students on this trip, not only to get that experience, but, even as a history student, I like to think that, we're more informed than most people just because we're seeing the past and then we're seeing the parallels in the present. So we're a little less ignorant to the issues. But even after going here, I never realized just how kind of ignorant I was towards certain issues. And it really was eye-opening in so many different ways. I mean, it made me buy like 30 different books to educate myself when I got home from different authors that Professor Santow had recommended to us. So I just feel very informed as a person now than I was before. So it was very impactful. Okay.
Thanks, Nicole. Does anybody have any questions? Let me get my thing off of here so I can actually see people. There we go. Oh, now I can see everybody. Hi, everyone. Does anybody have any questions for me or for any of the students?
And you can certainly, I think, just speak up if you want to unmute yourself and just ask.
Yeah.
So I came in a little late, so I didn't know if this was a graduate level course or is it just a undergrad course? So that was one.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, hi, Professor Santow. You were my professor when I was at UMD.
Oh, sure. How are you?
Good. How are you? So the one thing that I have to say,
in there.
I wish this class was there when I was a graduate or a undergrad, because I feel like this history, being a history major, I felt kind of cheated. I'm not going to lie when I was there. The history was mostly world civ American history, but definitely didn't touch on this type of history, and maybe Latin America and European history. So there's barely an African track. I don't know if there is now. So yeah, so it's this is a lot of progress. So I'm really proud.
Thank you, and it's good to see you. It was an undergrad class, so it was an honors class because I couldn't get the money to do it through other means. So that's why it was done through the honors program. I would love to be able to run it out of the history department rather than the honors program, and through Black Studies as well, so that it's open to anybody who wants to do it. You know, well, this is not the place to say this, but the department, as chair, I've been trying to get a hire in African American history for several years. So I'll just make note of that here and plant the flag in this meeting. I can make a larger argument for it. But you know, we in this day and age, you know, we're committing a kind of malpractice as a public university, I think, to go along with points that Ethan and Nicole both made. If we do not equip our students, regardless of major, with a much deeper sense of our nation's own history, its inequalities, its injustices, and the efforts of Americans of all backgrounds to try and turn it in a different direction. We're not equipping ourselves to understand the world that we live in, or to try and create the world we want to live in, you know, without that. And of course, we have amazing faculty at UMass Dartmouth that all try in various ways to do that. But this is a very unique and relatively speaking inexpensive way to provide a really a kind of profound life-changing experience for students without leaving the country. And I might add a life-changing experience for the faculty as well. You know, I had gone down on a scouting trip to see, you know, where are the hotels and where should we eat, and, you know, how much is the museum on a Monday versus a Wednesday, and that kind of thing, and to meet the people that we then met on the trip. And that was a lot of work and a lot of research to do that. It was good work in the best sense of that. But, you know, I was working that whole time. I did that. And then when I went on the trip with the students, you know, you never really understand something, I think, as a teacher until you see it through the eyes of students. In the first couple of days of the trip, my daughter also came along with, and that added to the power of it for me, I think. But, you know, I desperately want to do this trip as often as I can. But, you know, like everything else, it does cost some money. So, so we do want to try and do that if we can. But, you know, it's an incredibly worthwhile experience. Does anybody else have any questions?
Any other questions? We're coming to the end now, so if anybody has any questions. So I would just like to say that this was really profoundly moving. I had to get off, and I have a catch in my throat right now. I had been to most of those places and on my own when I was traveling for business. And this moved me more, just hearing about it through the eyes of your students. I do think it's remarkably educational, so thank you. I hope that there's an opportunity. Mark is my neighbor, so I'm hoping that there's some opportunity for him to do a full-on adult trip, you know.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because when I've described this trip to people in my neighborhood, they're like, well, why don't you just let's just all go. So what I would say is that if there are UMass Dartmouth alums that would like to just do a trip, you know, I'd be happy to, you know, I'd just, you know, feed me some chicken gizzards and tacos while I'm down there, and I'll go. I don't need to be compensated for it. You know, I'd be happy to take people, especially if we can find a way to help that to raise money so students.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I mean, I don't know what UMass Dartmouth's policies on, but you know, alumni trips happen all the time from you know, other universities. So. Yeah. Oh, and our dean. So thank you, Dean. So I'm saying Dean, but he's not a dean. He's the vice chancellor of advancement, but his name is Dean. And he's saying that we should try to organize an alumni trip. So that would be great.
Yeah, I would do that in a heartbeat. I would love to do that.
I think if you were willing to open it up so that alums and students could go together, that's in my experience, that's been particularly powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a whole bunch of different reasons for doing that. I think the conversations would be really interesting, and I think, if it helps make it more affordable for students to do it too, that would be great. I just want to take students in any group way, shape, or form. So if that's a good way to do it, I'd be happy to do it. So.
I do want to thank you all. The chancellor did have to step off for his next meeting. But I want to thank you all very much. That was really, as I said, profoundly moving and educational. I'm so glad to have had the brief opportunity to meet Nicole, Ethan, and Raymond before we started. And I hope I hear about your studies in your various locations in 3 different countries. That will be wonderful. Mark, thank you so much. And Vice Chancellor Hickey, thank you too for attending. There are lots more things going on this afternoon and this evening. I'm hosting English and Irish style bingo at 7 p.m. tonight, and we have prizes. So we have a rip-roaring good time, and we'll close out homecoming tomorrow with our book club, which will happen at 10 a.m.
I just want to throw out there, I'm hosting the Alumni Diversity Leadership Council at 5 p.m. So
I'm coming.
I'm inviting all of you guys to join in. It's an affinity group that it started to kind of start the conversation of diversity and inclusion on the campus and helping students and alumni and university bridging that gap, especially with now we have a new chief DEI there. So these are ground roots conversation starts with us, and then so hopefully they will move on up to the administrations.
Wonderful.
Very cool.
And I will point out that even if you didn't register for homecoming, we now have all the links available. So if you go to umassd.edu/homecoming, you'll see the homecoming page. And if you just drill down, like it says what's happening Friday, Saturday, if you click on that, the links are right under each topic. So you can just join that way rather than going through registration, which is closed, So, okay. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you
everybody.
For attending.
Nicole, Ethan, and Ray, thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday. It was really good to see all 3 of you.